this talk is going to be a little heavy on healthcare. And that's obviously because 10 years ago I was paralyzed and have made a great initiative in my office to scoot some things over on our plate to make room for hospital design and hospital equipment design. Let's just go to the next. I started after graduating from school working with George Nelson in New York. And George was a terrific storyteller. Seemed to me he didn't care very much about design. He would come into the studio and tell a few stories and then go back to his office and have lunch. But he was awfully kind to me and very generous. I once approached him and asked him if we could use his office, or the office of the firm, at night to work on the Roosevelt Memorial. My friend Richard Meyer and I were going to do the competition. And he said, yes, that would be fine, no problem at all, except why don't you do it in the daytime too? I'll give you the time. And so he never saw the scheme, but of course when it was all done it said George Nelson scheme for the FDR Memorial, and Richard and I were a little chagrined that we didn't get billing. But nevertheless, that was George, and he was a man who was always happy to have a camera around his neck, as you've seen those pictures of him. After working for Nelson for a while, I was lucky to win the Prix de Rome. And here's the American Academy in Rome, where 2 days ago I've just come from. And I taught 3 weeks in Rome for the Notre Dame and Miami programs. And so I come to you a little bit lagged, but not too. My studio is up in the upper right-hand corner. And I'll tell you a little bit about my time in Rome. When you're there, first of all, I was a kid from the Midwest, the only one in my graduate class that had never been to Europe, which tells you something about Harvard. And I was obviously delighted to go, but couldn't believe my good fortune when this was going to be my home for the next 2 years. I dutifully, as we all did, went to lunch and dinner at the Academy, and after a few dinners, heard the scholars talking about their postdoctoral work and so on, and realized that these people were really smart. And I had been brought up at the University of Cincinnati on Mies van der Rohe, no Palladio, and at Harvard on Le Corbusier, no Palladio. In other words, no history whatsoever. And I wasn't smart. I was downright lucky and pretty swift with my hands to get the Prix de Rome. But decided right there and then that I wouldn't join in the conversation at dinner, but instead, after dinner, would get myself to the library of the Academy and work until midnight to try to get, as the television series calls it, to get smart. I needed to have the confidence to join that conversation. In the second year, I did. But I worked and I drew and I traced and I traveled and I did improve my historical knowledge to the point where I really thought I could be a part of the Academy family. Well, there I am. Notice the tie. We were asked to be good representatives of the United States. And so here I am out on the streets of Rome, drawing and painting and so on. And I did that for 2 years, did over 2,000 drawings, and they've been published. And I was happy I did that because we didn't make much money being fellows at the Academy. I think a trip over and back and plus the Academy was worth $5,000. So there wasn't much left. So I sold my drawings for $50 a shot and allowed my then wife and I to travel all over Europe. And we did the Grand Tour, which was my last lecture for NeoCon, starting in Greece and going up through Mesopotamia and across to Venice and back down through Florence, Siena, Rome, and ultimately Naples, where the great digs at Pompeii were occurring in the 18th and 19th centuries. And the Grand Tour artists mostly from England and France would copy those things coming out of the ground and then use them as souvenirs to take home to mom and dad. But they were extraordinary, and they are now in shows at Sotheby's and Christie's, and they cost a pretty penny because they've become a genre in themselves. Here are two of my drawings. Now these drawings are huge. They're on 30 by 40. I'm going to be coughing today because I did catch an upper respiratory infection when I was there. So bear with me, I'll get through it. But this is obviously San Carlino alle Quattro Fontane, which I saw 48 hours ago. Hard to imagine. And St. Peter's Dome, and I actually saw the Pope. Well, I saw his hand. He was in the Pope mobile and he stuck it out. I couldn't quite reach it, but people were getting very excited about that. I didn't, but they did. And my 11-year-old son got a very good picture of him. He was up against the barriers, and Papa went by him in his Pope mobile and took a picture. Everybody excited. But here are these two drawings. But my friend Leonard Anderson, who was a painter at the Academy, said, "Michael, you know, you draw these things on the ground, and you look up at the monument, and then you look back down again, and draw a little bit, and then you look up again, and you're losing the proportion of what you're drawing. It would be so much easier if you'd get a small sketchbook and draw and look at the same time." It took me 1.5 years to learn that. But those little drawings didn't sell. So you never know which to do, maybe both. The one thing I learned in Rome, but it didn't sort of catch on with me until a year or two later coming home to the States, was the question of humanism. Here's my painting of Rome after Corot. And humanism is something that is now near and dear to my heart. And when people say, "Are you a modernist? Are you a postmodernist? What are you?" I would say, "I'm an architect." And then they would say, "Well, classify that more." Then I would say, "I'm a humanist." And they would go away with their tails between their legs because they don't know what that means. Well, you know it means that we're working day and night for all of us, not technology, not the computer, not the budget, not the rain staying out. All those things are natural to architecture. Of course you get that. But what do you get when you hire an architect? You should get somebody who's in your corner doing what you want and making objects that work for the humankind. Here I am starting my teaching. How about those glasses? Teaching architecture at Princeton with a student project behind me. I was asked to teach a beginning course, which the students quickly named Spots and Dots. And as I said, the modernism didn't leave immediately. Here are two early projects for me. The first two projects I did upon returning from States. The one on the right is for my best friend in high school, who was also the quarterback on the team, and I was the center on a T formation, that means we got to know each other very well. No more needed to say there. But nevertheless, we built their house, and then in addition to a house in Princeton, and I didn't know that they would be the biggest commissions I would get for many years. As I started to get additions to houses in Princeton, Queen Anne houses mostly, and changes to the kitchen too, so much so that I was called the Cubist Kitchen King. In architecture, you really don't get one till you've got one. It's really catch-22. If you want to do an office building, your client says, show me your list of office buildings that you've already done, or a school building, or a hospital, or even a house. And I got a wonderful promotion from the Museum of Modern Art to do a house for Nelson Rockefeller's son and his wife. And I hadn't done a big house, so I set up my apartment in 27 different ways, moving things around, making him believe that this was the dining room and this was the living room and this was this great house in Princeton. Just a little cheat, but I knew they wouldn't come to see my house. So anyway, I designed the house, and then he went to one of his classmates at Brown to get it built. But nevertheless, here is the first competition, second major competition I entered. The first one was a bridge in Fargo and Moorhead, North Dakota, and Minnesota. And we won that competition, but we were beaten out by a golf course by one vote in the runoff for what the city would put its money behind. So golf trumped culture, and that was that. The next one, because of that, I was invited to enter the Portland competition for addition to the Portland City Hall, essentially. And there were 3 architects invited after a long list of 20 or 30. It was finally pared down to 3. An ultra-modernist from Canada, Arthur Erickson, and then a kind of mild-mannered modernist from Philadelphia, Aldo Jergola, and then this weird guy from Princeton. And we were lucky to win. We were the only ones on budget and on time with our proposal. So it wasn't the architecture that won, it was our budget that won. So they were surprised to get what they got. But now it's just been entered into the National Register, so I'm very pleased it's there about 15 years early. So any Republican mayors can't tear it down as they want to do, because it was built in a Democratic era in Portland. And we know how smart the Republicans are. What's happening today? Anything? John Boehner grew anything between his legs? I doubt it. I really doubt it. If there are any Republicans in the audience, you're excused. I'm not political much. But I didn't know when I was first paralyzed that the then sitting president didn't understand the difference between science and health. But he didn't, and so there were no studies in stem cells for 8 years, thanks George. So you wonder why I think of the world as political. But that competition led to more competitions, and we did 5 in a row, and it was just luck, but we won 5 in a row. So this is, some of you have been to Napa Valley, and this is the Clopergas Winery, which we're very proud of. It's just been sold by Jan Schrem, the owner, and so we'll see what happens to it now. I think good things will happen. As the owners of Dean and DeLuca have bought it, we'll see what they do with it. One of the last competitions we entered, not the last, but one of the last ones, was to add on to a former Ford dealership that had become the city library for Denver. So it was a very small building, and therefore the new building, I thought, had to be broken up into smaller parts. And here's the Denver Library as it stands today, next to a crumpled piece of paper masquerading as a museum by Danny Libeskind next door. A tragic building. You bump your head against a wall. Now that's hard to do, unless the wall is leaning like this. Try putting a painting on it. Well, that's not what it's about. Thank you. But here's my library. The rare book rooms is at the top of the rotunda, and we're very proud. I'm very proud of this as a work of architecture. The last competition we entered was for a $5.5 billion with a B dollar project, 6 hotels, a maritime museum. What's going to pay for all this? Obviously the casino in the basement, retail, spas, and all of that. And it's been built for about 1.5 years now, and raking in the dough. And so the client's very happy with it. And this is built in a little island called Sentosa, right off of Singapore, where you can actually take a bridge or a boat to Sentosa. The Chinese come here to gamble. They're 5 and 6 to a single room, and they get up in the morning, put on their clothes, and go out to the gaming tables, lose all their money, and come back and write checks from there on. It's tragic too, but that's what's happening. I was a part of it. In the midst of all that, I did know how I'm going to get my water. Minnie, can you help me? We did a competition for, it's all right, you can stand up. I'll ask for that again, sir. Thank you. She's going back genuflecting. Here's my Humana building built in Louisville, and we're very proud of this as it had an international group of architects. Lord Foster, I love saying that, he says he got second, but I think everybody got second after we got first. But one of the things we did, you can barely see the 19th century stuff here on the right, and then the box on the left that the Humana building came in. But our building sticks out in front to be equal to the height of the 19th century buildings of traditional Louisville, and our tower then springs up behind it. The chairman and the CEO, or the CEO and the president, pardon me, wanted to be in this top floor, and I thought that was wonderful. They wanted to have all the action and a roof terrace. Well, there is also a roof terrace at the top where that big belly and the belly button stick out onto Main Street and are supported by a steel truss, which is reminiscent of the steel bridge that spans the Ohio right there at Louisville, right below our site. At one point, we were invited to design a sterling silver tea set for Alessi. 12 architects were invited, and Alessi wanted to show the world that these kinds of products could be thought of as art. So what he had us do was design these tea services with no budget whatsoever. He didn't care because he was only going to make one. And their prices ranged from $25,000 to $40,000 because of the sterling silver. There was a coffee pot, a teapot, a sugar, a creamer, a spoon, and a tray. Well, lo and behold, ours caught on, and we sold 40 in the first year. That didn't make Alessi happy, actually. because he wasn't in the sterling silver game. But nevertheless, he supplied them. And now a lot of museums all over the world have RT service. Well, we're happy about that, but what that caused was Alessi to come to us and say, you have a kind of commercial side to you, it seems. That was a put down, an Italian put down. Maybe you would do a tea kettle for us, as we've got one by Aldo Rossi and one by Richard Sapper, and they both have tiny flaws in them. And I'd like to do one without flaws. I don't like to have people send us their tea kettles back and for us to fix them and send them back to them. So I want you to make a kettle that boils water faster than any other kettle on the market and is an American kettle without flaws. I didn't know what an American kettle was. I asked him if water boiled a little differently in Cusinello, Italy, than it does in the United States. He didn't think that was very funny. Anyway, we designed this ubiquitous tea kettle, and we're now on 2 million of them sold. I didn't write a very good contract, or I probably wouldn't be here today. I would have invited you all to my island. But we get less than 1%, 1 penny per kettle, so I needed a lawyer. I didn't have one. We were just starting. But because it sold so well, we got to do many more objects for Alessi. I think close to 100. And here are some of them. There's a family there in the center that the tea kettle spawned, and then other objects. And there's the sterling silver set right there on the lower left. Some of you know it. But anyway, we were happy to get to continue to work with Alessi. He's gone on to younger architects and designers now that he can make good contracts for Alessi with, as we've all gotten savvy. We worked for a lot of different people, one of them being Steuben, who's now been swallowed up and is no longer in business. But when you work for Steuben, when you go to their factories in the Finger Lakes in New York, they insist that you blow a piece of glass. You can't do anything for them, show them a design until you've blown a piece of glass. I thought, how hard can this be? Well, I started out, I wanted to make a glass, a drinking glass. I ended up making a doorstop. It was a lump of glass, which is now a very big deal in architecture. There's a whole movement in California called blob architecture. This would have worked out fine for me, except it was probably too reflective. We also worked for Dornbrecht and Dervet and Hosch doing lavatory equipment, just never came to the United States because of our laws, and it's too complicated to get into, but something dealing with the drain. But it's still selling well in the Middle East, but you'll never see it unless you go to places that are at war, and I doubt that you will. I was sitting at my table in Princeton waiting for a group of people from Target to arrive, and one group had already arrived in my office and the other was a little late on the train. And they were there to talk about the renovation of the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument was going to be paid for by Target, and they were going to do a new elevator and a new observation platform and all of that. And they had asked me to be the architect. They didn't want to, they needed an architect that would wrap it in scaffolding, but they didn't want it to be a Christo-like affair. They wanted something else. So what we did after several tries was this. But before I get into that, there was a moment where the people that were there sitting around and having some breakfast with us and so on. And my sketchbook was on the table. The man sitting next to me, Ron Johnson, said, "Could I look at that?" And I said, "Of course." And so it's not like looking at somebody's diary because they're just drawings. And he said after 5 or 10 minutes, he said, "Michael, there are a lot of things in here that we could use at Target. Would you consider designing for Target in our stores?" And I said, "I've never been to a Target because there weren't any in the East at that time." And he said, "Well, we can arrange that. How would we go about it?" And he said, "Well, you could go around putting a yellow Post-it on all the things you think are ugly." And after seeing them the first day, he said, "How did you do?" And I said, "I ran out of Post-its." So that got us started designing it for Target. At the same time, we were doing this scaffolding. And then we did the scaffolding, and I used the running bond that the way the monument is built in the first place, but obviously the stones are much smaller than that. I wanted a book written by somebody, and they did do a pamphlet on, for the kids, why does a building need to be repointed? What is an obelisk? Why is it called Washington? Who was Longfall? And all the pertinent questions that a kid might ask, and why did you make it glow at night, and so on. Well, it's being renovated again, and they did use the running bond, but oops, they forgot the scrim, so all you get are just bright lights on the monument today. So that's a bit of a disappointment. Money again. Thank you, John. But that would be Bader. Boner. The slide on the right is something that was a joy to me. I got a call from the White House, and Hillary, we're on first name basis now. Hillary said, "Would you try to convince Target to keep the scaffolding up for 3 more months, because we know it's finished and they're going to start taking it down any moment. But if you leave it up for the turn of the millennium, we'll have something to rival the French and the Eiffel Tower." And so I called Target, and they were delighted to do it, and so I got a couple of dinners out of it, and that was nice. So here it is lit, and here it is again for the turn of the millennium. And that brought on all these products for Target. There were hundreds. We worked in almost all the different areas of the store except soft goods, meaning clothes. But all the hard goods we did touch one way or another. Oh well, that says what we tried to do, democratization of design. And we like to take credit for that phrase because it was a way of making a handle humanistic and a handle for somebody who's arthritic or who is an octogenarian and can't open the jelly jar. How do you do that? And we made implements that could do that for Target. We had 15 years of wonderful time with Target, and then the man who was sitting next to me and looked at my sketchbook had moved on to Apple, and from Apple he moved to take over J.C. Penney. Well, that didn't go very well, but nevertheless, he called and said, "Would you be willing to switch to J.C. Penney? I'll offer you a store within the store, a shop within the store." And that was an offer I obviously couldn't refuse. As we just had at Target, we were being diminished daily, it seemed, because when we started at Target, we were the only designers from the outside. By the time we ended, they had 500 in-house designers. So many so that I think they're the biggest design house in the world now. So there wasn't room for me anymore at Target, so we went happily to J.C. Penney, and I hope you do too. These are Penney objects, the new toaster in the upper left, and then one that my friend Don Strum likes to call the trophy in the upper right, and a lamp and a pot, a vase on the lower left with something in it. I'm not quite sure. But I didn't, as they say, style it. But we're very pleased with the outcome of our store at JCP. And here is our shop. And there's a lot there, and it's all on sale, 30% off. That's what caused the problem in the first place. Ron Johnson said, this is the fair price, $8. This is the fair price, $14, whatever it was. But Mrs. Q Public wanted a sale. So they had to make the $8 thing $22 on sale for $8. And then people started to come back. Tell me. I mean, I think they're Republicans, and they must be Republicans. So that's what the problem is, JCPenney. We used our little bird from the Lassie tea kettle for our logo, and switched its material to bronze. We got upscale. And then this fateful date in February occurred. I was returning from a week in Europe where I looked at a new site in Geneva for a new building, and it was below zero, and I was out on the site all day long. I already had a sinus infection, and also went to a Frankfurt fair, and then came home, gave 2 lectures in New York, and then finally back to Princeton. And that was on Sunday. By Monday, which I think is the 23rd, I was paralyzed from here down. I had a sinus infection that went from my sinuses to my brain to my spine, and they don't know any more than that, except that I won't walk. I thought for the first few months that when they said you'll be walking in 4 months, they meant it. But that's when George Bush entered the scene.